Hey guys, how's it going? I always feel like a dork when I say hi to you guys, just so you know. Okay, today we get to talk about one of my favorite time periods in history. Woohoo! If I could give a class on just this period in history, and I would be a happy teacher. Oh man, if I had all year to talk about this form. But I'm not going to tell you what it is quite yet. Before we do that, we have our quote of the day, which is the secret to getting ahead is getting started. So let me tell you guys, the majority of the energy it takes to do something is put into starting something. And I was a really bad example of that today. I super procrastinated with doing lessons, and now I am seeing the benefit, the consequences by working really late in order to get these lessons done. So don't be like me. Just get started, and as soon as you get started, you'll be like, oh, this is so easy. So also great life lesson, not just for right now, but for the rest of your life. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about dun, 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 dun. Let me share my screen. Share. We're going to be talking about ah World War II, woohoo! So we'll do a quick overview. I wish, like I said, I had more time to talk about this, but we don't. So we'll talk about key battles. We'll talk about who's on what side. We'll talk about when the U.S. got into the war and why. Just like in World War II, the U.S. didn't jump in right away, or sorry, just like with World War One, the U.S. didn't jump in right away. They decided to wait a little bit um, to join, and we'll see why that happened. Some of you guys probably already know why that happened. But so beginning, World War II began in 1939. Remember, we have World War One that started in 1914, ended in 1919, and then we have this 20-year period where there is semi-quasi peace in Europe. There's definitely tensions growing. Um, and Germany's a little upset that it lost the war, and they had to take all of the blame. That was part of the Treaty of Versailles, that Germany had to take all of the blame of what happened during World War One, and so they were kind of pretty hurt. And then Adolf Hitler came to power, and World War II officially begins in September of 1939 when Germany, which is right here, invades Poland. Now, if you guys notice, these boundaries are a little bit different from the modern boundaries that we can see on a map today. But we will see, well, because of World War II, these boundaries are going to change. Okay, but we have the US. The US was still kind of recovering from the Great Depression. They were starting to get out of it, but coming into World War II or entering into World War II was what officially took the US out of the Great Depression. But they still declared neutrality at the outbreak of World War II because they didn't feel like they needed um, to get involved yet. However, also similar to World War One, before the U.S. entered the war, they were supporting their allies. They were supporting Great Britain and France and Russia, who were the biggest countries in the Allied countries at that time. So they were supporting with with sending over weapons and money and helping them with stuff like that. And during this time, FDR was president for this entire war. Actually, FDR was president for more than the typical 2 terms that presidents run. Um, we'll see what happened to him. He actually did not make it through the end of World War II. So we have two wars of groups of powers. We have the Allied powers, just like in World War One, pretty much the same countries. We have Great Britain, Canada got involved in this one, Australia, France, the USSR, Poland, Belgium, Brazil, China, New Zealand, Yugoslavia, Denmark, and then, of course, the United States. Let's see, Great Britain at this time, at the very beginning of the war, Winston Churchill became prime minister. He was a very, very important figure in this war. Let's see, the USSR was led by Stalin. At this time, the USSR was still on the Allied powers. And then on the other side, we have Germany, of course, led by Hitler. We have Italy, led by Mussolini, Japan, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So if you guys look right here, The difference in the numbers of how many countries were on each side, that already could be an indication of who's going to win. But Germany had a lot of anger, like I already said, and the anger always fuels lot of a lot of things. So what was going on in Europe before the US got involved? The 9th of April, these are just four of the really most important events that you'll hear about. World War II, the 9th of April, Germany invaded Norway and Denmark. So first they invaded Poland in September of the year before. Then Germany started invading other countries, Norway and Denmark. On May 10th, 1940, German forces swept through Europe in what was called the Blitzkrieg. The Blitzkrieg is German for lightning warm. So they just took tanks, they took airplanes, they took anything that they had. They just went and they destroyed Europe as much as they could. And I'll tell you why in just a second, what their philosophy behind that was. On the 4th of June, 1940, was the Dunkirk evacuation. So there was a lot of Allied troops that were in France. Dunkirk is in the southern border of France. There was a lot of Allied troops in that part of France. And so they staged this civilian evacuation, not civilians as in evacuating the civilians. Part of it was that they evacuated some civilians, but they asked civilian boats and ships, like, hey, you have a schooner, you have a speedboat, whatever you have, go and we are going to use these boats to evacuate British forces from the French beach in Dunkirk. There's a really good movie they made about that. You guys should watch it. It's great. There's so many good movies made about this time period. Okay, and the 22nd of June, 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. Remember, they were part of the Allied forces. So Hitler's plan to take over the world, it was kind of a two-step plan or two-part plan. The first was what's called I'm going to so mess this up. I'm sorry. Lebensraum. There we go. And so that was his plan to take over land. He wanted to expand. He wanted to become this great empire. And then the other part was what he called the final solution. And his idea was to make a master race, which only consisted of the perfect people in his mind, who they were Germans, full-blooded Germans. They had absolutely no physical defects. They had no mental defects. So that would be people with autism, people with any learning disability, with Down syndrome, with scoliosis. If you were born without a finger, that would make you not part of the master race that Hitler had in his mind. So his plan was to take over the land so that this master race that he wanted to create, and so this master race has a place to live in. Now, like I said, if anyone was not Hitler's ideal of perfect, this includes the Jews, is one we're going to talk about the most. This includes also other religions like the Jehovah's Witnesses. It included Gypsies. It included Slavics, which are people from Yugoslavia, which is not a country anymore, actually. It was one of the countries that dissolved after World War II. But anyway, so any of these people in 1933, which is actually before the war broke out, was when the first concentration camp opened, and anyone who blatantly opposed Hitler or the Nazis were arrested and they were taken to these concentration camps, where, of course, we all have heard about the famous gas chambers where they just killed masses of people. They were either beaten, they were worked to death, they were forced to do slave labor, and a huge number of Jews were killed. I'll mention how many later. It was millions and millions of Jews were killed for absolutely no reason. Not just Jews, these other people that I also talked about. And then, okay, so now we get to the attack of Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941, and that is what finally convinced the US to join the war. It was an attack on this naval base in Hawaii by Japanese. And because of that attack, the US was like, okay, we can't just ignore this thing anymore. But they decided, instead of focusing on Japan, they decided that Germany was the real threat, because that was kind of the center place of the war at that time. So they decided Germany was the real threat, so they were going to fight mostly back on the Germans. After Pearl Harbor happened, Other important events we'll see June 16th, 1944, known as D-Day, which I'm sure all of you guys have heard about. It's when Allied powers stormed the shores of Normandy, France, another important place in France. There's also a great movie written about D-Day. Please watch it. It's fantastic. December 1944 through January 1945. So this battle lasted approximately a month, the Battle of the Bulge. Then we have February 4th through 11th, 1945, was the Yalta Conference. And that was when the superpowers of the Allied countries, so the United States, the USSR, and Britain, Great Britain, met together and they decided how they were going to not divide up Germany, but how they were going to basically make sure Germany followed their side of the deal when they lost this war. At this time, the end of the war was imminent. Germany pretty much knew that they were going to lose. And so they wanted to have a really solid plan because what had happened with World War One is they had the Treaty of Versailles and the whole the Paris Conference, and because the terms weren't really strict and there was no way to they weren't enforcing them, then Germany was able to break their side of the deal, which led to World War II. So they got together to talk about how they're going to make sure Germany didn't do that again. In February of 1945, there was the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is a very famous battle. And I realized I should have put that picture up here. If you guys have seen a picture of people raising the American flag, like 4 or 5 soldiers right after each other, raising up the American flag. That's from the Battle of Iwo Jima, April 28th, 1945. Actually, in April, 3 of the major leaders of during World War II actually died. So first, and I forgot to write this down, April 12th, 1945, FDR died. He was becoming very frail and very weak. It was a mix between just exhaustion. Being a president is really hard. He had been president for a really long time. So he just wore down and he actually just was sitting for a picture and fell over dead from a internal brain hemorrhage. So he died at the beginning of April. In April 28th, 1945, Mussolini was killed. And then 2 days later, Hitler commits suicide because, like I said, the end of the war was imminent. A few days later, on May 9th, 1945, Germany officially surrenders. They didn't have their strong leader anymore, so they had no other place to turn except for throwing their hands up and being like, that's it, we're done. So, but that wasn't the end of World War II. The other Axis powers continued fighting, and in August of 1945, after FDR had died and Truman became president, the US decided to drop atomic bombs. Now, this is interesting. It's the only nuclear warfare in history. We'll come to the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there in those periods of history, nuclear warfare was not actually used, it was just threatened. So these 2 atomic bombs, the first one dropped on August 6th in 1945 on Hiroshima, and the second one dropped on August 9th in 1945 on Nagasaki. Those are the only 2 atomic bombs, or the only 2 nuclear warfare actually used in history. And then just a few days later, Japan surrenders on August 15th, 1945, and that's when World War II officially ended. So some of the effects of World War II, are still seeing the effects of World War II today. There's a lot of racism that happened, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. The biggest one, most notable, is with Japanese people, because with Japanese Americans, because Japan was one of our enemies during World War II. There's actually Japanese concentration camps type things that um, were present in the United States. There was also some wariness of Jews in the U.S. The U.S. has been accused of not doing as much as they can or as they could have for these Jews that were being oppressed in Europe. Um, Besides that, we have 70 to 85 million casualties. 70 to 85 million people died in this war between the Jews that were murdered, and the other people that were murdered in concentration camps, which historians think are to be on probably on the light side, between 10 and 11 million people were killed in these concentration camps. Probably more. We don't have really, really good records. And it's estimated that up to 75 or 76% of the Jewish population was killed during this time period. Um, so Hitler was succeeding in his purpose to get rid of what was not his idea of the master's race. In the US, there's about 420 million people, or sorry, 1,000 people that died. So you can see we didn't have really huge casualties. We had the benefit that it was not, there were very few battles fought on our shores. We had some casualties, obviously, in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, also in one of the U.S. colonies called Guam, which is very close to Japan. There was quite a few casualties, but overall, there was not a huge. Obviously, we don't want to see people die ever, but 419,000 people died from the U.S. From there was also a huge decline of the European colonial empires, which were, if you guys can remember from expansionism, we talked about France, we talked about Great Britain, Germany, Belgium was one of them, and I can't remember the other big one right now. If you remember, shoot me a message, and I'll give you an extra credit point. And there is also a rise in two other superpowers, the USA and the USSR. They emerged as superpowers during this time period. After this is when we'll have a lot of issues with Lenin and the USSR, because of a point I'll get to in a second. Okay, so then we have the creation of the United Nations. There was something called the League of Nations, which was formed after, I think we talked about it, after World War One. That was the dream of the US president, and I just blanked on his name. Um, Eisenhower. That was Eisenhower's dream. He didn't actually get to see it come around, but the League of Nations was formed. No, the U.S. didn't join the League of Nations. That's right. So the League of Nations kind of dissolved, and the United Nations came out of that. And the United Nations is a governing body. It's something that's tries to keep peace between different countries. That's still around today. There's a increased rate of decolonization in Middle East and Asia. So those countries that had colonized Middle East and Asia started pulling people out at a faster rate, and let the colonies just govern themselves. There was a rise of communist influence in Asia. So we're going to see that mostly in China and in Russia, and we'll have problems with that a little bit later on in history. There was a collapse of economies and infrastructure, especially in Europe, where the majority of the fighting happened. This is one picture that I found. It's not super, super descriptive, but you guys can definitely see the destruction that happened. If you guys look up picture of post World War II pictures, they just devastated a lot of places. There was a lot of bombings that went on because of air warfare was something that became a lot more common during this time period. Tanks, all sides used a lot of tanks. They used a lot of weapons, and so there's huge destruction. And due to this, or at the end, as we came out of the period of World War II, there began to be tension between the Allies and the USSR, which will then, in the future, in the near future, will bring us to the Cold War. Okay, here are my sources. If you want to look into any of those, feel free to. And let me show you what your next assignment is. Now that you've watched this video and we've learned, you don't have to take notes. Don't worry about doing that. But what you do have to do is you're going to complete this Google form that you already started. This is me, and it will be a different picture. Don't worry. Write the code word. I'll tell you guys in just a second. Make sure you use all capital letters. And dun, 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 here we go. Okay, so your assignment is going to be to look through this thing. It's called the Auschwitz album, and there will be a link here. I forgot to put it in beforehand, but the link will take you to this page. This is called the Auschwitz album, and this album is one of the only surviving visual evidence photographs from what happened in this concentration camp. I'm pretty sure all of you guys have heard of it at this point. If not, Auschwitz is one of the biggest, most popular concentration camps, or death camps, as they also liked to call them. And there's not great records. The Germans did a pretty good job of destroying a lot of things because they didn't want to take the blame. So as you can read through this, and then it says in order to access the album, you're going to click here. I don't want to risk it because my computer is being really slow. So the other way that you can look around this page is to click these 3 horizontal lines, and there'll be various sections. I want you guys to look through all of these sections. I guess I should click on one so you guys can see what it looks like. Maybe. So you're going to click on the section. There's going to be an arrow on the sides so you can scroll through. No, nope, too long. Okay. Right. Presenting. So you guys will scroll through, and as you go through, the answers from the questions are going to be in the comments or the whatchamacallit presenting. All right, now that is all that I have before I leave office hours today. So if you want to ask me questions, if you have a question, and if you have any missing work, please turn it in to me so I can put your grade in. Thank you for your patience. You guys are doing amazing. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of all the work that you guys are doing. I know it's not easy. It hasn't been easy for us either, but we are doing an amazing job. So keep at it, guys. Love you. And before we end, of course, I have to give you the code word. This code word today comes from 1 John 3. No, it's 1 Peter 3:8. I'm sorry. 1 Peter 3:8. It says, "My dearly beloved, let us not love merely in words, but in actions and deeds." So my challenge for you this week is to show, and the code word is love. My challenge for you is to show love to someone in a tangible way. Do something, whether it's for your parents, whether it's for your brother or sister, your grandparents, anyone that you're living with. It could be for your teacher too. Showing love would be sending them an email and saying, "Hey, I really appreciate what you do." So if you do something like that, I would love to hear about it. Send me an email or jump on Google Meets. Either way. Yeah, that's all for today. Have fun looking through that album. It's such a cool resource. I'm so excited for you guys to do that. And last thing. Okay, next week we are going to be writing a newspaper about World War II. So what I want you guys to do, if you think of a topic, you will write that on the last page of your Google form. Just write in if there's a topic that you really want to cover.